Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fourth episode of Beyond Talking Points. I'm Matt with my co-host Matthew. Today, we're going to do kind of what we did last week, where we're covering just a variety of news stories. We're also going to catch up on a couple that we've wanted to talk about, but just haven't had the time. So with that, just very brief intro, I'm going to throw it over to Matthew, and he's going to lead into the first story we're going to talk about.
Good afternoon, everybody. We shall start today with a story from CNBC. U.S. lawmakers push bipartisan bill to raise the federal minimum buying age for tobacco to 21. And the bill would include any tobacco products, cigarettes, cigars, e-cigarettes. It would also prohibit retailers from selling tobacco products to anyone under the age of 30 without photo identification. So, I wanted to bring this up because I think it is a stupid idea.
Oh, you think that's stupid? I think everybody thinks that's a stupid idea. I agree with that completely.
Because, well, there are several reasons. One, I mean, I think 18-year-olds, for example, some states have a age for alcohol. You can only drink alcohol or purchase alcohol, when you're 21, but they get it anyway. So I think 18-year-olds will find a way to get tobacco anyway. But more importantly, I don't think the government should be in the business of dictating what I do with my body. Now, I don't smoke, but I don't think it doesn't make sense to me why the government should say, "Oh, you can't do that."
Well, yeah, if you're 18 years old, you're legally an adult. So these are legal adults who are still going to be prohibited from smoking. This is why people criticize the drinking age all the time.
As they should.
Yeah, a lot of people on the left even criticize the drinking age, even though because the idea is people don't get exposed to alcohol before they go to college. Then they go to college where there's a binge drinking environment, and they're like 19 and they've never been exposed to drinking, and now they're doing it in a shady way because they have to get it illegally, so they go to sketchy parties, and this just fuels bad behavior. So a lot of people agree with that, like form of describing what's going on college campuses, and that it's not a good thing. So then the idea of now let's prohibit cigarettes too is just silly. This is just backlash to lawmakers freaking out about e-cigarettes and teenagers vaping. The obvious reaction to me doesn't seem to be, so we ban it to people up to age 21. You're just going to adjust the black market for it. It's clearly illegal for 16-year-olds that vape already. 16-year-olds can't go in and buy a vape, but they're still getting it. That's the issue. Teenagers that aren't 18 are getting vape, like stuff to vape with. So why does raising it to 21 suddenly make that harder for them when it's already illegal for them? So it's not related to that problem, even though that's probably what spurs this on a lot in the public eye. So that's completely stupid. Then the thing that bugs me is when you're 18, you're old enough to vote, you're old enough to go in the army, but you're not old enough to take in certain substances, even though you're legally an adult in other ways. It's like you need to be consistent about that. That's why that's the main reason why I think alcohol, the legal age should be 18 instead of 21. This is just government paternalism in a very obvious, direct way. Sometimes it's usually more subtle when there's paternalistic policies. This is just in your face. You're an adult, but we're going to make it so you can't do this for 3 years because we don't think you should be able to be stupid. But you know what? You should have the legal right to be an idiot. So yeah, this is dumb. This is why Republicans and libertarians are actually different. And this is an easy example, like the drug war and this kind of crap. So yeah.
Well, this is why. That's another reason why it ticks me off. It's a bipartisan agreement. So both parties are willing to say, yes, you are 18. You should not be allowed to have tobacco in your system. It's like, come on.
Well, and it shows that there's really not, like, the Republican Party is the party of small government when they want to be. But
Exactly.
then there's plenty of times where they just kind of are like, yeah, but we see the good that this policy will do, so we're not small government here. And it's like, oh, so you're just like Democrats with slightly more caveats. Okay, got it. So it's disappointing to me. I hate this kind of crap. Yeah, I think it's pretty cut and dry. Do you want to move on from this, or do you have any final thoughts?
No, I pretty much said all I needed to say.
Okay, well, the next story we're going to move on to, this is one that I wanted to talk about on our first episode, because it was around 420 when we recorded our first episode, and Ben and Jerry's released this like whole ad campaign and like put out like a statement on 420, and it's all about legalization of marijuana. And when you first see it, it's like, okay, cool, Bernie's, it's cool because Ben and Jerry's, they're like, pretty far left. They want legalization of marijuana. I agree with that. I was happy. But then the full video they put out, and then the statement they put out is actually all about essentially how Black people are discriminated against in drug use, and that's the real issue. So, I mean, I guess I'll read a little bit from this, and then I'll kind of say why it bothers me. So pretty much here. So, and even if you're not in a state that legalized pot, there's still a pretty good chance that the cops won't hassle you as long as you spend 420 doing your thing, if you're a white person. Sorry to bring you down, but that's the harsh reality. If you love pot and you're white, everything is totally awesome these days. And then it gives some statistics about how many white people are executives for cannabis businesses. And then it goes on to give a lot of stats about how Black people are arrested at larger rates for marijuana usage, even though people self-report that they use marijuana at about equal rates. So I guess the reason this misses the point for me is because I think the real issue, just from the start, is these are people who are imbibing in a substance for recreation, and they're getting thrown in a cage for it. If you get arrested and you're white, even if it's like only a third as often as Black people, that's still an injustice to that individual. It's an injustice for everybody who's arrested for these laws, because it's stupid that people could get thrown in a cage for smoking a substance that the government doesn't like. I think that's like upfront the most issue. I think Ben and Jerry's framing it in this manner about race and how it's essentially white privilege that people don't get thrown in prison. They essentially are racializing this issue, which is going to make it less popular. If you say we should legalize marijuana because white people are racist and unfairly benefit from privilege, then you're not going to get as many people on board the legalization train, which is annoying. The other thing is these stats are like really moving, but I think they I think there's reason to nitpick them a little bit, because if there's a community that's overwhelmingly white and the only self-reported crime in those areas are people smoking pot in their houses, it would make sense for cops to assume that those areas were quote unquote safe because maybe there's less violent crime. So if there's less police around in an area, then there's going to be less people arrested for smoking pot. If Black people are more likely to live in poverty and like in lower income areas, just because the unfortunate demographics that our racial wealth is in the United States, there's more likely to be crime in poor areas, and poorer areas, because they're poorer, are more likely to have criminals. And like that's just how the situation is. And if there's more criminals in an area, police are more likely to just arrest people in general because they're there, and if they see you smoking pot, you can get arrested. So it's like, it's one of those things where it's like, I'm sure there is some discrimination happening, but I feel like the stats overstated a little bit, and they're missing the point that the real issue is people who smoke pot in general, no matter what, should not be thrown in a cage. So yeah, it just bugged me that they had to take this angle instead of just saying, yes, being able to smoke marijuana if you're an adult is obviously something that should be legal for everybody in the whole country, no matter what. So yeah, that's my little rant. Feel free to nitpick that and take that apart.
We're in complete agreement when you say nobody should be thrown in a cage for smoking 420.
I'd hope so.
It's the government trying. I think you called it government paternalism. So it's also been called the nanny state.
Yeah.
So the government trying to like a nanny tells a child, "Oh, you can't do that. You can't do this. Why? Because I said so." So we have no disagreement there. I do think, or I would also like to quote the article a little bit, just one brief statement, actually. It said, quote, "There were 8 million arrests for pot between 2001 and 2010. During that period, a Black person was 3.73 times more likely to be arrested for possession than a white person, according to data from the American Civil Liberties Union." Okay, so what does that mean? I looked at the study that it linked to. It's titled "The War on Marijuana in Black and White." It was published in June 2013, so it's actually quite old by now. I would be curious if the ACLU would publish a new one to see if the numbers are similar. So it said, the study also said, 88% marijuana arrests, 88% of which are for possession offenses, have risen since 2001 and accounted for over half, 52%, of all drug arrests in America in 2010. And it gives some more examples. So in Washington, D.C., for example, there were 1,489 arrests, black arrest. This is the rate per 100,000 people, I think. So out of 100,000, for arrest. Sorry, I'm stuttering.
389 arrests per 100,000.
Yeah. Did I say 389?
No, that's what I thought. Is it 3.89 per 100,000?
Oh, 3.73 times more likely.
Oh, okay.
I think is what we're talking. I was going to read some quick stats.
Okay, gotcha.
Sorry, I'm stuttering.
You're fine.
So in the District of Columbia, 1,489 arrests for black people possession of marijuana, and then in DC it was 189 arrests, making it in DC 8.05 times more likely. In Minnesota, it is 837 arrests of black people for possession of marijuana per 100,000, as opposed to 107 for whites, making it 7.81 times more likely. And in Kentucky, 697 arrests of black people for possession of marijuana per 100,000, as opposed to 117 arrests of white people, making a 5.95 times more likely. And then it also, I looked at, you mentioned the surveys about, who uses it. It said in 2010, 14% of blacks and 12% of whites reported using marijuana. And in 2001, the figure was 10% of whites and 9% of blacks. And then it also said in 2010, 34% of whites and 27% of blacks reported having used marijuana more than 1 year ago. So, and it also said that it got all these statistics from the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program. Now, it could be that this is not the best way to speak about marijuana legalization. I don't really have an opinion on that. I do think, though, from what I've read, from the studies I've read, that there does seem to be some fishy business going on involving arrest rates for among the races for drug-related offenses. A part of it might just be that that say black people might be more likely to be poor, and that poorer people might be more likely to be arrested for drug use than a wealthier person. So there are.
Well, the argument that I was making that you just kind of touched on, it's not that poor people are necessarily more likely to get arrested for the fact they're poor. It's just that if you live in a poor community, there's more likely to be more crime in the community, which means it's more likely for the policing to be different in that community, right? There's more likely to be cops watching the area if there's more crime in it. Now, if you're like a middle-class white person and you smoke weed in your house, and the only time you ever do stuff is like once and you're in the suburbs aren't policed the same way that the inner city is in like Philadelphia. So if you have lower communities that happen to be more ethnically black, because it's just, that's the wealth distribution in the United States, then it seems like they're attributing the disparity inherently to just racism, when it could be that these factors that play into the average, like the quote unquote, like the mean of what a black person is in the United States, when you look at like their income and the areas they live, those communities are policed differently because of these other factors, and that's going to skew the racial data. I guess that's the argument I'm making. I'm sure there are plenty of bad actors. Like, I'm not saying all cops are great. I'm sure there have been cops that act poorly, and there are some cops that act like I'm sure there's some cops that are racist, just like I'm sure there's some people on the border patrol who are actually racist. Like, I'm sure that's a thing, but I don't think there's this key systematic thing that's specifically singling out black people because they're black. I'm pretty sure it's just the way that policing works in these areas. And you can't really, if you're just looking at broad state by state numbers, you can't really look at that, which is kind of why I have issue with like the new Jim Crow, like that book that's all about this, and some of these stats that Ben and Jerry's put out. But like I get what you're saying though. It does seem fishy, but I feel like there are some explainers that if you could factor them into the data, would equalize it to some extent.
Perhaps. I do think that we need to, as a society, look at our criminal justice system and try to improve on it. I don't know how you feel about that.
Well, of course, that's why I brought up the article. I don't think any of the people who are thrown in, whether it's black people who are, affected by the way the policing works, or white people should be arrested for these nonviolent crimes. You're smoking weed because you like weed. That's a huge issue with our criminal justice system. None of these people beat somebody up, abused somebody, infringed on somebody else's sovereignty. All they did was smoke pot, and they get thrown in a cage. And if you take that out and take out things like that don't have an actual victim, you're going to significantly reduce the people in prison.
But you would admit that if it could be proven that there was a racial disparity, that would have to be addressed.
Well, what you just read off is a racial disparity, but we can't attribute it to racism because there's other factors at play, right? Because of the income distribution and things like that.
Yes, and of course the income distribution does go back to racism partly.
Well, see, so this is one of those things where it's like if you start with it's because their race, then you can usually say it's because of their race, or you can say, well, it's because lower income areas are more likely to have crime, which is going to affect policing. So this is where I see like there being an honest disagreement. A lot of activists that are like black activists will say it's because of the race, and that's why they're turned into ghettos and then treated this way. But then a person could look at the data and the evidence and say, well, maybe it's just because people are more likely to commit crimes in these communities. And like, I think it should be a locality by locality basis. If, say, the inner city of Philadelphia decided we don't want cops to really police our thing at all because we think they're acting unfairly and we can find ways to handle it ourselves, I'm actually cool with that. I don't care. I just don't think this stuff like proves racism. Like, do you think this is enough evidence to show that there's clear systemic racism?
I don't think we can go solely on this data. No, I would have to. I do think the totality of the data that I've seen, at least, shows some racism in the criminal justice system.
Well, if you start talking about the problem with things like plea deals, and that's actually, there is something about that I wanted to touch on this article specifically, but we can get to that in a minute. If you look at plea deals and you look at jury sentencing, then you can get to like some actual things of, is this racism because juries are more likely to sentence a black murderer to death? Like, you can talk about those things could actually be an issue because of some prejudices that people aren't aware of, I guess. Maybe you can have a conversation there. But also, we know that our system's kind of broken already because a judge is more likely to sentence somebody longer if they sentence them before lunch as opposed to right after lunch. So it's also like our system is that it's already ridiculous in the sense that such a slight thing can affect things like sentencing. It's not surprising that race could then be have so many effects like that. I guess when I look at the issue of criminal justice, I like to think in very broad issues that are clear and have a clear solution. And I just think the first clear solution is to decriminalize nonviolent behavior that doesn't have victims.
Of course.
So it's just like, it seems like such a slam dunk instead of, them going on a rant about racism that might not actually be racism. There might actually be decent explanations for a lot of it. And that's why I was so irritated by this.
No, we as I said, we completely agree on the what we think our policy should be towards marijuana. Perhaps I'm a bit more, or perhaps I look at the details. Perhaps you think a bit more broader on this issue, and I think more in the details. That could very well be our disagreement.
Yeah, the thing is there are so many studies on these kinds of things, and there are so many other explanations that can't be taken into account in an easy quantitative manner. And then that's what bugs me from some of the conclusions I see people make, where it's like, sure, you can say there's a disparity and people can draw from that it's racism, but I feel like that's not inherently true.
It could be racism. That would be it could be racism.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure like some of the arrests are just because certain cops are bad people. But it's like, is that the difference like between 200 per 100,000? It's like, I don't think it's that many cops are racist.
It's not. I don't think it's that cops are. I'm not going to argue cops are bad people. I don't think it's a good people, bad people thing. I think it's. I think it just some of it can be boiled down to our unfortunate history involving race, which we are all. We're all affected by, whether we realize it or not.
See, I find that a completely unsatisfying way of thinking, I guess, because like you can say the income disparities potentially come from our history of racism, but
it certainly does.
Well, to some extent, actually, there's been a lot on that. If you look at the way people's wealth changes over their lifetime and income inequality in general, there's actually not as much of a case for over hundreds of years that really is true. Now, the thing is, like, because of all the discrimination going on like 50 years ago and then 30 years ago, like you can argue that that's inhibited some people, but I don't think that's the obvious explanation for every black person that's not middle class or higher. I don't think it's that obvious, because I see all kinds of white people that are poor, and it's just because some people make bad decisions. And it's like, I'm sure some people who are minorities are unfortunately afflicted by their starting position, didn't do them any favors. But it's like, I've also seen people who are born in a good situation that are both white and minority, like, fail. It happens. So then when people use this as this be-all explainer of the aggregate, I find that like completely... I just find that unsatisfying explanation. I don't think that's the true case. I think it's an oversimplification. No.
I think we're talking at cross purposes here.
Okay.
No,
okay.
I'm not. Obviously, there are white people, black people, Latinos, Asians who make good and bad decisions. I'm not denying that. In this respect, I guess I am speaking more broadly. Broadly speaking, across our history, the white community has had the opportunity to create more wealth for itself than the black community. And I'm not saying it's the only reason that we have a racial disparities in this country, but I think it is one reason.
Yeah. Now, then the question is, how much of a reason is that? And then it's like, and then who remedies what? And it just seems like the easiest thing at this point is to treat everybody equal. And we just say everybody who is suffering, we help. And then if we do that, then it alleviates those kinds of issues just by bringing people up that just need help in general. And then by continuing to make your race-based, you're going to leave back certain people.
Well, I agree we should help everybody who needs help. As I mentioned, I think in a previous episode, I do think reparations are necessary, which is another disagreement that we have. And because I think if I remember correctly, you said something to the like of, you don't think we should be punishing one group to help another, or something like that. And I don't think it's. I'm not here to punish. I don't think white people should be punished. This isn't punishing. This is, and I'm not, because I don't think I wouldn't be taking the reparations from. I wouldn't be saying, oh, white people should have a tax on them, on their income because they're white, and we should give that to black people. That would be a form of punishment. I don't agree with that. The reparations would be coming from the government funding.
Well, okay, so here's where you and I draw a huge difference in our political philosophy that we'll probably get into next episode. When I say we should help poor people, you assumed that I was talking about via the means of government. I see government as a way of using the state's monopoly on force to coerce people to funding things that they don't always agree with. So when you say, hey, we should fund reparations because in the last decades and decades ago, certain white people are terrible, which, a lot of white people were terrible and certain minorities were screwed over, it's like, cool, but that doesn't mean you should coerce the populace into paying for this. And that's why I see it as a punishment, because now you've taken this policy and coerced a bunch of people to pay for it who don't agree with it. Now, I think a lot of people can do a lot of things to help inner city communities. Like I think Bill Gates could drop $10 million in Philadelphia, and they could do all kinds of things in charter schools and help kids get ahead, because currently they're getting horrible educations through public schools. There's so many ways that individuals could make a difference, or charities can make a difference, or people can opt to pay for things. But once it's about coercing the populace to pay for something that there are good reasons not to agree with, I think it's a bad idea, which is why I disagree with you on reparations.
If I can add one more comment, and then I guess we should move on.
Yeah.
We probably won't come to agreement on this issue.
Yeah.
But I just want to say one thing. As for getting people to pay for something they don't agree with, I mean, I'm not going to argue that maybe government is generally a bad thing. I think I mentioned I've read some anarchism, and I'm somewhat sympathetic to anarchist thought. But at least at this time in our lives, in our history, we have governments. Governments are everywhere. And it seems to me, if you're going to make the argument that that reparations are just a way of the government coercing people to pay for something they don't agree with, I mean, they kind of already do that anyway. That's kind of the nature of government. They do things that maybe some people don't agree with to keep the government going. I mean, I
put that in very broad terms to kind of make a point. I'm sure we're going to talk about this next episode when we kind of talk about our political philosophy more in depth. I think you can make a case that there are certain functions the government should do. And then once you go beyond those functions, you're making everybody pay for it. I think how we were talking about, we both agreed that if somebody decides that they like smoking weed, you shouldn't throw them in a cage for it. And I kind of feel the same way about if 51% of people vote that they like a certain program and you don't want to pay for it, well, you have to pay your taxes into that to pay for that program, or else you get thrown into a cage if you decide not to pay your taxes. It's really the same difference to me. Now you are kind of defending the norm. You're saying the government's fine. That's how we do it. That's just the way the world is, Matt. Get over it. I don't think that's a good reason for us to step back 3 steps and say maybe we shouldn't be coercing people to pay for a ton of stuff they don't like. But that's obviously simplifying it, and we do need to move on.
I'll leave it there.
Yeah, we
can talk about it.
I summarized the article about 15 minutes ago, so that was good. So let's move into the one on Nietzsche.
Yes. Okay, so I got this one off of the website called Jacobin. I think I don't know too much about this website, but from what I've seen, it's pretty much like a Marxist type, website. I'm actually not very impressed with it from what I've seen, even though I'm also somewhat sympathetic to some forms of Marxism. So basically, what it was arguing was that it's titled, I should say, "Why the Alt-Right Loves Nietzsche," meaning Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, who the German philosopher of the 19th century, I think.
Do you know when this was published? Like when they posted this up?
It was
just curious.
Published on January 2nd, 2019. So it's a little old.
Gotcha.
So basically, it's actually a book review. I haven't read the book it's reviewing, but basically the argument is Friedrich Nietzsche, Martin Heidegger, and Max Weber, all 3 German philosophers, are fundamentally reactionary philosophers. So I'll preface this by saying I know far more about Nietzsche than I do about Heidegger or Weber. I know almost absolutely nothing about Weber. Although I know, as I said, I know he's a philosopher from Germany. That's about it. I know a little more about Heidegger, and I know the most about Nietzsche. So my comments will be mainly on Nietzsche. I wanted to talk about this article because I hear this argument quite a bit, actually. People saying, "Oh, Nietzsche, we should, we need to be careful about Nietzsche. He's a crazy philosopher. He's a reactionary philosopher." But I actually think if you read Nietzsche's works, I mean, I haven't read his complete works, and I also don't speak German, so I can't read them in the original. But I've read some of his works in translation. I think if you really, and I've also read a lot about him. If you really look into his philosophy, it's very apolitical philosophy. I don't think his concerns were just far, far broader than any, particular issue that a political commentator would be focusing on. So that I don't think he's really of the left or of the right. I think Nietzsche, I don't think he even really thought that way. Now, as for Heidegger, there's a bit more of a conversation to be had there because he was, for a time, a member of the Nazi Party. So, that a horrible mistake on his part? Of course. No who's going to say, "Oh yeah, Nazism, that was a good idea." So, obviously I'm not going to defend that. But does that mean we can discount everything Heidegger said just because he made this mistake? I don't think so. I think, again, there are some philosophers who are very, very political. Marx was a very political philosopher. John Stuart Mill was a very political philosopher. So I guess that's really my main gripe with it. I don't think Nietzsche was really at all a political philosopher. Heidegger, maybe 50-50. I wish I knew more about Max Weber, so I won't say anything about him.
So your criticism of the article is that it essentially paints Nietzsche as a potentially authoritarian figure, even though you find him apolitical in general?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I'm not going to pretend like I'm an expert in any of these philosophers. From what I've read of Nietzsche, it seems like most of his stuff is more, it's not remotely political. It's about the world. It's about meaning. It's about all kinds of things closer to that, and which it's kind of, yeah, it's kind of ridiculous. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt you. I just want to add one more thing. An issue actually that happened was Nietzsche's sister and his brother-in-law were proto-fascists or proto-Nazis, or whatever, if you understand these nuances in term. That they were actually very right-wing authoritarian. And so what happened was, Nietzsche was, we're not sure exactly what happened, but anyway, about 10 years before his death, I think, he basically went insane, or perhaps maybe some people think it might be syphilis. Again, we're not so sure, but anyway, he basically wasn't conscious for the last 10 years of his life. He was basically in a catatonic state. And so during that time and after his death, what Nietzsche's sister did was she rewrote his works and she rewrote mostly his unpublished works. And she tried to create this image of Nietzsche as a right-wing authoritarian. And I think there's even a picture you can find on the internet of Nietzsche's sister shaking hands with Adolf Hitler. So she really was a right-wing authoritarian, and she tried to create her brother into a right-wing authoritarian when he wasn't. I'll let you pick up from here.
I appreciate the history lesson there. I don't know a lot about Nietzsche's personal history. I knew he was in a catatonic state for a bit, and the whole syphilis thing. So I guess most of my takeaways from reading this what wasn't necessarily if I thought their critique was right or wrong, but I just noticed a lot of reoccurring themes. And since I'm not a Marxist and this is a Marxist author, I clearly had some problems with their worldview. I'm not sure if you're interested in entertaining that because it's a little bit different from what
Absolutely.
you've talked about.
I don't mind. Yeah, that's actually also some of my criticisms, but the apolitical, or Nietzsche being apolitical, was the first one. But go ahead.
Okay, so I found it very unappealing that this author. I found that they often conflated capitalism with authoritarianism, and I thought their examples were really. I thought they were funny. Because I don't know if you guys know the whole thing of if you like argue with somebody, you're actually more likely to make them feel more validated in their point. And since I'm coming from the opposite perspective, I felt like this person was scoring points against themselves like every other sentence. There's a specific part where the author essentially critiques certain libertarians. They call out Mises and Rothbard specifically, who have a lot of interesting work, but I think they did have some fascist tendencies that are looked down upon, and that's why they're not bigger in the Libertarian Party. And then there's also, they talk about Pinochet in Chile and how that's the whole thing where the Chicago school kind of led their economic policy, but in the end, General Pinochet is a dirtbag who kills his own people, and he's an authoritarian. Which was funny because they talk about the free market stuff, and they're like, but then here's a tad bit of authoritarianism. And they imply that the issue there is capitalism. And it's like, it sounds like the real issue here is that they weren't capitalist enough, and they actually think it's cool to kill their own people or to become fascists. But that's not what capitalism is. Once you start oppressing people and not letting them make their own free decisions, that's not, capitalism and authoritarianism are the opposite ends of a spectrum. So it's weird how there's all these capitalists that the author liked to touch on. And then to essentially say the capitalists are evil, they point out the few times they're not capitalists and the few times they are actual oppressors, which is completely unrelated to their belief that a free market is good and people should be allowed to freely exchange. And they imply these two things. The fact that they were bad people in certain aspects is obviously related to this capitalism when it's completely unrelated. The issue is they weren't libertarian enough, not that they're too libertarian. So I read that as a complete author scoring points on themselves. And I'm like, do you not see this? Am I the only one? So yeah, that was one of the big takeaways. I was in like the middle of this piece.
We can certainly discuss the general tone or even the general thesis of the article. We don't have to just focus on Nietzsche or any of the particular philosophers mentioned. I actually think this is a problem with the left in general, probably the far left in particular. They have such tunnel vision to where it's basically as if they're saying, oh, does this article or this author, does it repeat what Marx and Lenin and those people said? If it does, then it's superfluous, and if it doesn't, then it's worthless. Throw it out. In other words, they can't seem to learn from anybody else except from these few authors that they've approved of. As I said, Marx, Engels, Trotsky, who have you. Maybe some would even defend Stalin. Who the heck knows? So I think that's really it's a dangerous way to view the world, to be so narrow-minded. As I say, I've flirted with some Marxism, some anarchism, but I've read all sorts of things, and I try to be able to learn and explore from many different perspectives. I think that's the only intellectually honest way to go about life. So I would agree with you I would agree with you in that they certainly have a historical tunnel vision.
Yeah.
And now, as for capitalism and authoritarianism, I don't think politics is, of course, the political spectrum is a very tricky business to actually pin down. I don't think. I think you can have some capitalism and some authoritarianism, but there are obviously authoritarian governments that aren't capitalist. The Soviet Union was authoritarian, It was not capitalist. I would argue that China is pretty authoritarian, and they are pretty capitalist. So perhaps we somewhat disagree on that. I think authoritarianism and capitalism can come together, but not always.
Yeah, so here's the thing. You can have a capitalist nation that engages in capitalist activities, and then there can be an authoritarian head of state. The issue is a lot of the author of this particularly critiqued libertarians and then pointed out the few times they were essentially believed something that was fascist, and then they conflated the fascism with the capitalism and insinuate that the fascism is innate to capitalism. And it's like, see, because they're a capitalist, they're a fascist. And it's like, actually, if they were more of a capitalist, then they would actually be like not a fascist at all. Because if they completely were free market capitalists, it'd be completely letting people act upon their own will. It would be imposing nothing on them.
Historically speaking, it's actually the exact opposite. Capitalism has led to far more freedom.
Yeah.
Because capitalism was breaking down the feudalism, the days of feudalism, where people were extremely limited in what they could do. So I agree with this.
Now the broader point that I thought that this made me kind of realize is the more I've been exposed to just random things on the left, the more I feel like people are doomsaying about capitalism essentially coming to an end. I mean, you see this in Marx, whenever that was written, hundreds of years ago. You see that when in the Zizek debate, he's all about, everything's coming to an end, the end of capitalism. Then the Ray Dalio thing is all about capitalism is unsustainable. That's essentially, the same stance as Elizabeth Warren and all these people in the Democratic primaries that we're talking about. All of them are doomsaying capitalism is all these problems. And I see very little evidence to believe that. I think people are overstating how bad they think the current time is. I don't think people have good evidence that we're coming to an impending clash. So that's what this article kind of led me to, especially at the end. I think I have a direct quote. Okay, here we go. Well, they talk about we can treat it as a proof that reactionary anti-modernism will accompany capitalism and Marx's word to its blessed end. We can pose a dichotomy, socialism or barbarism. So it's just like, okay, that's how you see capitalism as barbarism, and you think it's going to come to an end soon?
Can I add something to that?
Yeah, go for it.
I think, as I think I've said this probably several times now in this podcast, I do think we are in for some huge changes. I'm not certain exactly what those changes are, but I think we are in for some big changes. I do want to add, though, I think people should be very wary when they talk about, in that quote it said the blessed end of capitalism or something like that.
Yeah.
Again, I think capitalism has a lot of problems, and it might not be sustainable. But, and it's a this is an important but. I think we need to be. We don't want to just see the end of capitalism, because the end of capitalism, or if we want to, if the end of capitalism is inevitable, like some of these people are saying, in a sense, I think that's very scary, because there are certain aspects of capitalism that I think are that I think are indispensable for living in a prosperous and just society. So I think, a lot of these Marxists, they end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and they forget how in some passages Marx was very complimentary of capitalism. So that would be my distinction. I'm not one of these lefties that is cheering the end of capitalism if that's indeed what we're approaching. I'm much more. I think we need to be much more careful. If the end of capitalism is approaching, we need to do what we can to save the best parts of capitalism.
Yeah, I guess what I was trying to say the issue isn't that I I just don't see the evidence as why someone would even think capitalism is coming to an end. I could see somebody making the argument that, like, hey, as technology improves, it's going to be more and more difficult for poor people to get jobs, or the uneducated people to get jobs, because uneducated people won't be able to get jobs. They will be impoverished because, all their jobs they're qualified for will get automated. You'll have to have all these skills with technology to be able to get a job, because we'll move so far in that direction. I just don't see why that's a failure of capitalism. Sure, you might have like a percentage of people who it's really hard for them to find work, and that'll be a problem our society will address. But that doesn't mean we're going to stop having businesses that make goods at a low rate and continually innovate. We've also been through hundreds and hundreds of years of technological innovation. So, and there's still been jobs that have survived at this point. So why do we assume that'll happen so rapidly in such a way that everybody will be out of work so fast? It's like, I understand that concern. And even if you agreed with that concern, I just don't see why that even would entail the end of capitalism. So when I see this kind of writing, I just don't even understand how they get to that end point where that's their argument.
I think, I don't know how much longer you want to go in this segment. I'll just add one quick thing. And if you want to add anything else after that, you can. I suppose my argument would be this: we should be able to think about what would happen if capitalism could not function any longer. Again, I'm not saying that's definitely what's going to happen, because I think anybody who thinks they know where history is going is a buffoon. If you were alive 200 years ago, would you think you'd be able to predict what life is like in 2019? No, nobody would be able to do that. So I just think, if I somewhat, again, I don't like this article, because I do think it is far too narrow-minded in its worldview. I just think that we need to be prepared for the possibility of something new coming along.
Gotcha.
That's it.
Yeah, that's fair, and I'm sure we'll have more discussions on this general trend in the future. So we've actually spent a lot of times on the first three topics, and the fourth topic we were going to cover, I wanted to spend. I know my co-host here said he's kind of indifferent to the issue, but I feel like once I make my argument, I feel like he's going to actually want to have things to say. And due to time, I think we should maybe jump to one of the other stories from the day.
I'm excited.
So I don't think we should do that right now. I think we should hold off to where we have more time to go more in depth. So how about we skip ahead to the Hugh Hewitt story where are you okay with that?
Certainly.
Yeah.
So Hugh Hewitt wrote a opinion piece for the Washington Post. It's very short. You can read it in probably 2 minutes. He makes two major points that I took away from his piece. One is he's certain that Donald Trump will win in 2020. The other point is he is congratulating Trump on or he is giving Trump the credit for how the economy is doing. He's saying the economy is wonderful right now, and it's all thanks to Donald J. Trump. I'm actually more interested in the latter point than the former point. I think it's a bit too early to say who's exactly going to win in 2020. If you want to go into that, we can. I'm more interested, though, when he talked about how the economy's doing and how we should be thanking the president for it. Because this is kind of a point that tends to irk me a bit. I'm not going to argue that the president has no power whatsoever in the economy, and that that who's president doesn't matter, because I think it does matter who's president. But I'm very suspicious of the idea that just one person, even if it's the president of the United States, has absolute. He didn't say absolute. I apologize. He basically said, the president has all this power over the economy and he's doing great things with it. I don't think that's really true of any president. I think the economy is far more difficult to understand, and far more beyond the control of any one individual. That's maybe a bit of a nitpick, but that is actually the reason I wanted to bring up the piece.
Okay, well, yeah, I had some stuff ready to go on the political analysis front, but I'm an economics student, so I'll talk to you about some good old econ. So Trump on the economy. Okay, so first off, it depends on how you measure the economy doing well. If you're an imbecile like our current president, then you measure the economy doing well based on the stock market, which is a very bad indicator of if the economy is doing well. Well, I mean, to some extent, it's a good indicator. If it completely crashes, then you probably do have a problem. But in general, like, it's trending upwards isn't like, a great indicator of things. Now, okay, I'm trying my best not to go on a whole rant about the Fed.
You're fine.
But so pretty much, Donald Trump has put in policies that are good for business because every business knows that Donald Trump is significantly less likely to put regulations on their random industry than, say, Hillary Clinton would. If Hillary Clinton came into office and she thought, if I put this certain regulation on business, I think, from a consequentialist perspective, that then it would benefit more people, even if I would disagree, she would maybe think so. And then there's more likely to be regulation. With Donald Trump in office, businesses, for the most part, know they have consistency in the terms of regulation. So due to having this consistency where they know they're not going to have regulations put on them, they can operate in a more effective, certain manner. And this helps businesses a lot. This makes it less scary if you want to hire new people because you don't have to worry on if you're going to actually end up essentially being penalized by having to abide by new regulations. That's a great thing. I love it. That's why I'm in favor of deregulation all the time. Unfortunately, our president has a very bad way of looking at trade. He sees it very zero sum, which means he hurts the market anytime he talks about tariffs because the issue here is inconsistency. He does stuff randomly. He didn't do anything on tariffs for about a year. So when he didn't do anything on tariffs, I was actually really happy with our president. I was a big fan of him because I thought my biggest concern on him, he actually talked about on his campaign trail, but he's not doing anything about, so I guess I don't care. Then
Your biggest concern of Donald Trump.
Yeah, and then Trump started doing tariffs, and then it scares businesses because now they don't have consistency in their supply chain. Now a bunch of parts that go into a product might cost 25% more, and when you're a business that puts out a high quantity of goods and only makes a little bit of profit per good, like that really screws you up. So this is how he hurts the economy. In general, the economy was going to trend upwards, and the fact that he is pro-growth in the sense that he doesn't overly regulate, that helps the economy a lot. I wouldn't give Obama that much credit because I don't think his stimulus was effective at all. And I don't think, and he did some regulations that were not good for businesses recovering. Like Obamacare had the employer mandate. So if you went from 49 to 50 employees, you suddenly had to provide health care. And even if that's an ideal, you're stopping every small company from taking that next step over because the marginal cost of going from 49 to 50 employees is a ton of money because suddenly it's 50 health plans that you now have to subsidize. So that's an anti-growth policy, even if some people think it's a good idea. So Democrats are more likely to put in these things that are good ideas, but burden businesses, which is going to slow down growth. So do I think Trump has had some positive effects on the economy? Yes. Do I believe in some sort of business cycle that would help any president right now? Yes. So yeah, overall, Trump could be way worse on economics. His tariffs are bad. That's a summary. Obama kind of stunk for the economy, but he's not president anymore, so who cares? And pretty much any president that wouldn't spend $8 trillion on their budget wouldn't tank our economy at this point. Although I think it's going to crash in like the next 2 or 3 years. It's kind of scary. But that's because of the cycle, not because of Trump. And it's also because of the Fed, which I'm not going to talk about right now because I don't think that we're prepared to have a debate about the benefits of the Fed because I don't think you're that interested in it.
If you don't mind me asking you a question, I'm actually quite curious.
Yeah.
This is actually more on the economics side.
Go for it.
How was your so if you still want to touch in the political analysis, that's fine. But I was just curious, what were your thoughts on when Obama signed into law the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the president or Donald Trump revoked it? Because I actually have some pretty strong feelings on it. And I'm just curious as to what your thoughts are.
Okay, so okay, I guess I want to put a couple qualifiers on this. I'm for free trade because I'm a capitalist, and I think people should be able to trade freely without penalty of governments intervening and putting tariffs on board. I'm skeptical of trade agreements that pose themselves as free trade, like the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. It's not a free trade agreement. It's a free trade agreement with 100 qualifications. That's the reason why, even though it's a free trade agreement, it's hundreds of pages long. A free trade agreement should say these countries will trade freely with no regulation. That should be a free trade agreement. It should be a quarter of a page. But NAFTA was hundreds of pages, and you had to do things like build a certain amount of the parts in Mexico before you could ship it to the United States or stuff like that to qualify. So that's not even a free trade agreement. So like him reworking NAFTA, I was less upset about because I don't really feel like it was even free trade. I feel like that's a misnomer. TPP, because it ended up getting revoked and never signed into law, I'm not confident enough to know if it was truly a free trade agreement. Since Trump railed on it, the real issue wasn't that Trump got elected and didn't like it. The issue was people liked that Trump railed on it, and then Hillary even turned against it, and Bernie turned against it. So nobody was going to support it when anybody got elected. So that was kind of a sunk cost to me. If it was truly a free trade agreement, then I would have been all for it. I just don't know the details. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I was just kind of curious, actually.
Do you have any? I think we're going to have to forgo the political analysis because we're nearing an hour rapidly.
I think we have plenty of time to go into the political analysis of the 2020 election.
Yeah, I'm sure something really dumb is going to happen. Bill de Blasio is going to officially announce that he's going to run for president, and then we'll be like, well, let's talk about this, and let's talk about and let's talk about what we actually think about the election. But yeah, on that note, I think we're going to wrap up. Our next episode is going to be more about our political philosophies and why we align with certain candidates and parties for the 2020 election. And we're going to talk about that a lot in detail. So you can find me on Twitter at MattKeckBlog. If you want to hear more from me, I usually just post links to the episode, and sometimes I'll post quick articles or something like that. Where can they find you?
They can find me on YouTube. Just type in The Anti-Philosopher.
And you can see videos of our podcast uploaded there, and we might be putting out some of our own individual content at some point, so feel free to subscribe. And on that, signing off, Matt and Matthew.